In this video, we're going to look at how we can use the Postman tool to perform API testing and vulnerability exploration and exploitation. Postman is a very popular tool when it comes to testing APIs. It gives you the ability to send API requests, inspect the responses from the API, and look at any potential issues that might be present in the API. By being able to programmatically send and receive requests to an API, we can automate and inspect all of the functionality of that API, and additionally, we can start to manipulate that behavior of the API to see if there are any vulnerabilities present or weaknesses in its implementation. So let's get going and see how this works in Postman. The first thing we need to do is have an API that we want to test, and we're going to put the address to that API where it says enter URL or paste text. In this case, I have an API running on the localhost at port 5000. So my URL to the API that we're going to be testing today is http://127.0.0.1:5000. This is the base URL that points to the API, and all of the different API routes are going to be appended onto this URL as we go. So let's append one of those API routes now, and we're going to start with the /login route. So to the end of the base URL, we type /login. And now we're going to be hitting the login endpoint for this API. Next, we need to set what kind of method we're going to be using for our API request. If we click the drop-down list next to post, we can see that we have many different options available to us in terms of HTTP methods. In this case, we're going to be leaving it as post to the login endpoint. Now, we technically have enough information to start sending a request. So we can see what this API will do if we send just this request with no body by clicking on the send button. And at the bottom window of the screen, we can see the output or the result from our request. And it tells us that there's a 500 internal server error. And we have a bad request in that we sent a request that the server could not understand. And then we have a key error telling us we're missing a username key. So this is telling me that I'm missing some key fields in this request. So we can start to build out this request now by clicking on the body tab and then clicking on form data, and we can pass specific keys. And we know that we need to pass a username key. So I'm going to put in username as the key value here, and I'll put in a value of admin. And then likely, I also need to have a password key. So I'm going to type in another key for password. And we don't know the password, so let's type in test. Now we've added form data to our request, passing along the keys that the endpoint is expecting. So once again, I'm going to click send, and now I can see at the bottom in the response window, I get a message saying login failed. And we kind of expected that because we didn't know the password value, we just put in an arbitrary value. But let's see if this API is vulnerable to SQL injection. With SQL injection, we can try to give malformed inputs to make the API behave in ways that it shouldn't. In particular, we could try using a --, which in most SQL implementations is used to end an SQL query, and we might be able to use that to bypass the password check on this login endpoint. To do that, I'm going to go to the value I passed as a username, and I'm going to craft it as the end of an SQL query. So it's likely that the username is quoted in the SQL query. So the first thing I want to do is end that quote by putting in a single apostrophe at the end of the admin value. So now I've simulated the username value being finished, and now I want to just end this query here. So I'm going to put in --. And so now instead of a query like select star from users where username equals admin and password equals any value, I'm trying to stop that query at select star from users where username equals admin. So I'm going to go up and click send again. And we can see at the bottom that the login has been successful. And not only that, we can see the user is admin, and it's told us that the username's password is password. So I've gotten information about the user, and I've proven that this API is vulnerable to SQL injection. Now, let's test the API to see if it's vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is similar to SQL injection But instead of modifying the SQL query through malformed inputs and unsanitized inputs, with cross-site scripting, we're going to be trying to inject scripts directly into the API. So we're going to start by changing the endpoint that we're hitting on the base URL to /welcome. Now we're going to pass it a name field, and then we're going to pass it a script to pop up a JavaScript alert. And that looks like this. We pass a name equals, and then inside of that equals, we pass a script to pop up an alert saying XSS. We can get rid of the form data for this particular request by clicking on None in the body. And then we're going to change our post method to a get method. And then we're going to click Send. And we see that we get a header back with welcome and the script that we passed to it. And this is because this particular web page displays a name field based on the value passed to it. So now let's try that same thing in a browser. And we can see that if we put in that same URL that we just passed via Postman, we do get an alert saying cross-site scripting, or XSS. So now we've seen that this API is also vulnerable to cross-site scripting. Finally, let's check if this endpoint is misconfigured to allow access to endpoints without requiring authorization. So the endpoint is going to be /data. So I modify the endpoint to be localhost/data, and I'm going to leave the method as get, and I'm just going to send the request as is. And I can see that the API has responded with secret, this is sensitive data. And I haven't had to do any kind of authorization to access that. So we can also see that there are endpoints in this API that have been implemented incorrectly to not require authorization for access. So this is how we can use Postman to test and evaluate APIs for function and vulnerabilities, as well as to exploit them during a penetration test.